Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can also check us out on Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can click subscribe, rate and review, share the episodes. We've had some really entertaining ones recently. And the rest of this summer is going to be a lot of fun. That is the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Be sure to check it out. And you can also check me out at www.patreon.com/SonicCinema. Starting to get caught up on the rewards over there, as well as giving a few exclusives, including, which is very appropriate for the discussion we're about to have today. I promise I will get my 10 favorite film scores of 2021 discussed for patrons as well. But for now, you can also listen to some early versions of cues for my score for Brian Ackley's film Player PhD. That is at patreon.com/SonicCinema. So the topic of today's discussion is film scores and film composers, in particular one that has meant a lot to me almost as long as I've wanted to write music. And he's a composer who is now a two-time Academy Award winner. His use of synthesizers as well as African and Asian musical ideas revolutionized film music in the late 80s and early 90s. And we are, of course, talking about Hans Zimmer. Joining me to talk about Hans Zimmer is a past guest on the Sonic Cinema Podcast. We discussed Orson Welles last year, and I joined him on his podcast, NostalgiaCast, to discuss Hal Needham's Rad. But we're going to be discussing Hans Zimmer today, and I'm pleased to be joined by Darren Lundberg. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you again for having me. It's that Orson Welles conversation was, I keep telling you this, one of the most enriching experiences I've had is being able to talk about somebody that I love and something other than superhero movies.
Oh yeah, and we and the thing is, we could have gone through so many more. I mean, we went through 3 films of his, all of which were really great, but I mean, we didn't even touch on some of his more famous films in that discussion. That is, and that's one of the things that is so striking about his career. But so I mentioned that you are with you host the NostalgiaCast podcast. Where can people check that out?
Well, we've got a link tree on. You basically just find me on Twitter at DW Lundberg. That's my handle there. NostalgiaCast. You'll see a picture of Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams. It's my avatar. There's a link tree, basically link that you can click on that has you can listen to Podbean. You can listen to just our main website, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. You can find us all in there. Again, we just finished up our second season. Johnny, my partner, is moving into a new home, and so they're getting settled. So we just decided that was a natural place to take a break. But right now you can catch up on all. I think we just logged our 61st episode, which is the Swan Princess. We talked about that with Raspberry Raz on Twitter, Margaret Raspberry, Molly Raspberry. She was a great guest, and so we were able to chat about all that there. But yeah, you can go back and look at all the movies that we chatted about. Movies from our childhood that we love. We talked about this last time when I was on with you, but obviously, movies that you watch when you're a kid, and then you lose track with them, and then you just happen to find them in a Walmart bin. So you just kind of happen upon the side of watching again. So it's that kind of feel for a podcast. If anybody who hasn't listened, is trying to catch up on movies that might not be, as good as we once thought they were, or they're better than we thought. It just depends on whether the nostalgia is underwhelmed or overwhelmed by the quality of the movie themselves. So definitely check this out.
Yeah, as a former guest as well as a listener on the podcast, I definitely enjoy the conversations that you have with your guests. I haven't had a chance to check out the Swan Princess one yet, but yeah, it's a lot of fun to talk about from that perspective. And I mean, obviously there are going to be a lot of movies that you're familiar with on NostalgiaCast, but there are also going to be ones that maybe you're not as familiar with. And I think that's where, but either way, you're going to get a really interesting conversation when you listen to that podcast. So be sure to check it out.
And even talking about Rad with you of all movies, we're able to dive in deep to a movie about BMX biking. So that was a really fun conversation too. So
yeah. I mean, it's not a great movie, but it's definitely an entertaining one, and it's definitely one that has stuff to talk about. Whether you're talking about from a sports perspective, whether you're talking about from an '80s fad perspective, whether you're talking about it from a soundtrack perspective, because one of the funny things about that, we didn't really touch on it too much. We talked about some of the songs, but I always get a kick out of watching that, the Hell track scene at the end of there, and the music to that is just not as engaging or rah exciting that you would expect for a big climactic race like that. And it's really fascinating to hear that. It's like, I mean, it's a fine little piece of film music, but at the same time, it's like, really, this is all you can come up with for this big. I mean, we talked about it on the podcast, on the episode, where it's like, Hell track is, because so much of it is predetermined, where Crew's gonna win. It was hard for them to get that suspense up. But actually, that is actually kind of funny, because there is a film from that was composed by today's composer Hans Zimmer that I think is actually a very good example of hitting the predictability of that genre, but making it exciting, but making it interesting from a musical standpoint. That's Days of Thunder, which I mean is a film that really hits all the bases as far as the sports genre, but I think does it very successfully. And I think Zimmer's score, which was his first for Tony Scott, really does a great job of that. But so I know where my love of Hans Zimmer came from, and we'll get into that. Where did you first really start to engage with Zimmer's music?
Well, obviously you chose your top 3 Zimmer scores, and I chose mine. So being a kid growing up, an only child, my mom leaving me with movies, you kind of get addicted to everything movie-wise. And as far as movie music goes, I think the most familiar was, everybody's familiar with John Williams, right? You've got the Star Wars theme, got the Jaws theme, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana, all that stuff. You're addicted to it. But I don't, as far as that goes, I think I was just addicted to the themes. Like, I could recognize the themes of those movies, not necessarily the music scores. Like, obviously I've got a lot more appreciation for it now, but the first movie I ever actually remember sitting down and watching and paying attention to the music from the get-go was Backdraft. The Ron Howard movie from 1991. I remember, I think my mom dropped me off in the theater. She was that kind of person that she could drop me off just to see an R-rated movie, and I was 13, 14 years old. But I remember sitting there, and that theme kicks in, that hero firefighter theme that just addicted me from the start. But then as I paid attention, the movie's not the greatest, but the music tells a story. And I noticed that in the theater. Like, they have the hero firefighter theme. They have like a softer, like, piano theme for the brothers, the McCaffrey brothers in there, and that tells a story. And then they have the theme for the fire, like kind of a wistful kind of thing. And Donald Sutherland's character, I think, has a motif that they play. And then at the end, my favorite track of all time of any soundtrack is on the release album. It's called "Show Me Your Fire Truck," which is obviously a quote from the movie. But that's my favorite movie cue of all time, because the way that it combines, and it's very subtle. I didn't notice it till later. It's one of those things that you kind of get in your head, and it's kind of it subconsciously affects you. But the way that Zimmer is able to combine the hero theme and the brother theme, and kind of have one overlay the other and play and he talks about that in the interviews that he's done since. But just the way that it told that musical story, and had like the Brian McCaffrey continuing on the tradition. of the family, but also being the hero, being a firefighter, that entails that. Just the way that the music told a story. And I don't know if Backdraft necessarily has themes as iconic as anything John Williams wrote, but I just thought that idea was fascinating as far as them able, the individual music cues, combining to tell this underlying story. And maybe it told it better than the screenplay told it itself. But yeah, that was my first addiction. And from then on, that's when I started going back and noticing all the new, the old James Newton Howard and James Horner. And I started getting addicted to all the music composers. Mm-hmm. Noticing that. But yeah, Backdraft, I call that that's my gateway into movie scores, just because that's when I first noticed and first fell in love with scores as scores and not just themes.
That's actually kind of interesting, and we can certainly go ahead and dive more into Backdraft, but to set a bit of a context with regards to Zimmer in general, he was an electronic musician in Germany with a bunch of new wave bands, and he specialized in keyboards and synthesizers. And then he lives in London, and he started doing advertising jingles. And he that was where he first partnered with Stanley Myers, who would become a collaborator over the years. And he would start to work on films, the 1982 film Moonlighting, Insignificance from 1985, My Beautiful Laundrette from 1985. His first solo score was Terminal Exposure, and he was the score producer on The Last Emperor, which won the Oscar for Best Score. And through this time, up until this point, he was kind of a marginal figure on the sides of film music, doing a lot of independent work, foreign films, stuff that most people would not necessarily be familiar with. Then in 1988, he had a big turning point with his score for Rain Man, which marked not only his first Academy Award nomination, but really set an interesting template because of the way that utilizes synthesizers, the way it utilizes unusual instruments in different instrumentations and sort of African instruments that we weren't necessarily familiar with in seeing in mainstream Hollywood or listening to in mainstream Hollywood films. And he also did score for A World Apart that got a lot of notice. And that was, and that year was huge. He got nominated for Best Original Score, even though he didn't win. And then the next year he got nominated. He also wrote the music for Driving Miss Daisy. So he had back-to-back Best Picture winners that he was involved with. And again, it was one of those. Now that one is interesting. I'm not as familiar with it, but just you listen to the theme of that and you can hear just a very different voice, I think, from what a lot of composers would do with that type of movie. And, we could, I could certainly go on about, go point by point leading up to Backdraft, but, one of the other key films they did at this point was Black Rain by Ridley Scott. And that was where he started to incorporate the Asian ones because of the fact that it takes place in Japan. And it's funny because of the fact that one of my favorite anecdotes about Zimmer is that he talked about how Ron Howard wanted him to write the music for Backdraft. And Black Rain was a big reason for it because of the way he uses synthesizers, because of the way he wrote themes and motifs. And Hans Zimmer was like, I don't know that, are you sure you want me? Because that's a dark story. This is a story about firefighters. It's about heroism. It's like, are you sure you want me for this score? And like you said, you can talk whether or not Backdraft is a good movie. I think it's a good movie. I think it's an entertaining movie.
It works. It's it's fine.
And it's one of those movies that I do think point the way towards Ron Howard being a more serious-minded filmmaker. Without that, maybe you don't necessarily get Ransom or some other films that we might be talking about here later in the episode. But when I went back and finally saw Backdraft, I didn't see it in 1991, but when I did finally see it, I loved, and by this point, I was a nut for Hans Zimmer. I was getting as many of his scores as possible, even for movies I'd never seen. Backdraft did definitely stand out, and it's because of the way that he manages to do some really beautiful heroic themes in that movie, but also keep it very sinister because of the dark nature of the thriller aspects of that story.
Yeah.
And the synthesizers are such a huge part of what he does so well in that.
Yeah, I like how you talked about with Rain Man. It's kind of an original. The synthesizers, because you have different obviously different stages of film scoring, right? Like the old days, like the Eric Korngold type scores. They're very big orchestra heavy. And then during the 60s, 70s, they kind of relied on woodwinds. I think 60s, 70s scores are kind of maybe not the strongest because they date. Like you can tell where they come from a lot of the time. And then you had John Williams in the time of woodwinds that came in and was like, no, I'm not going to do Jaws I'm not going to do Star Wars like that. We're going to go big. We're going to go big orchestra. And then a lot of people started relying on that stuff. I think 80s, not necessarily scores, but they really started relying on soundtracks, that kind of thing, like Rad or like Top Gun, those things to rely on musical accompaniment. And then with Zimmer having that electronic synthesizer sound, it is unique, but it works. I don't know, that's one of the things that I love about him. And it doesn't necessarily translate when he does live performances because the orchestral sound doesn't really capture the magic of that synthesizer sound, right? Mm-hmm. But with Backdraft, it definitely has an orchestral type synthesizer electronic sound, but it has the horns. It has for the wistful, the sad theme. When you go we go and that line is spoken, they play the horn theme, stuff like that. So again, it's very stand out, as like you said. It's just that. And I love that anecdote talking about, how Howard wanted the darkness and all that, but it's the firefighting sequences, which are the highlight of that movie, I think, because they're so visceral and so well shot, kind of stands out among the plot that's more B-movie oriented. Mm-hmm. But that music score and the way that it captures, like you said, that heroism or the hero themes, again, that's something that attracted me to that score. It's something that makes it, I think Zimmer has a track record of his scores being better than the movies that accompany them. You know what I mean? Because they and one of my picks definitely does that. But I don't know, that synthesizer, it makes it very unique. It makes it very him, and he's been able to incorporate more orchestral stuff and work both sides. I like that speaking of movies that don't stand out as far as the scores of that Dark Phoenix score, which is great. It kind of reminded me of Pacific Heights. It kind of reminded me of that 90s aesthetic that we have. I really love that score. But yeah, I don't know. I owe a lot of and from you, it sounds like you were addicted to Hans Zimmer when you came to Backdraft later after you were already addicted to him. I don't know if he had a lot to go on until Backdraft. He had obviously Rain Man, and Driving Miss Daisy, which is a fun score, but it's mostly just the theme that he repeats over again.
Yeah.
And it works. But yeah, it's definitely, I owe Backdraft a lot to my love of music scoring and love of music composers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talked about the electronic aspect of Zimmer's scores, and the fact that in the 80s, what we saw was this shift towards more song soundtracks, the combination of original music as well as songs to sell the movie. But at the same time, you do see this evolution, which had really started in the 50s with with them using Theremin for a lot of science fiction movies. And the theremin is an electronic instrument. So you started to see that used sparingly in the 50s, 60s, and then in the 70s, like you mentioned with John Williams. Although, I mean, I would say Jerry Goldsmith started as well with Planet of the Apes. And it goes back, I think, to 2001 using classical music. But the big orchestral sound. But in the 80s, what you also started with as the pop sound of popular music really started to codify around samplers and sound and keyboards and synthesizers, you do hear that creep into the movie. But it's not nearly as heavy in that. It's much cheesier, and it was in a lot of ways, it was kind of a cheap way to do a big sound. I mean, there are some scores from that era that I love that do that. But something like Wendy Carlos's score for Tron, or her work earlier for Kubrick and Clockwork Orange, is such an outlier that until Zimmer came in and started to really push the boundaries of it into a more serious level of film music that could rival a John Williams or Jerry Goldsmith.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Jerry Goldsmith. Sorry, I kind of missed out on that. But, I think like music scores too, until Backdraft, I think the thing that's great about Hans Zimmer is I can listen to his soundtracks just as soundtracks. Like I don't have to, like a lot of music scores, I think sometimes you need the movie to accompany him or to watch with him. But Zimmer has a way, and there's always something in his scores that it's very addictive, and it's just very like this could, and like a poppy sound, like it stands apart. Like it can be, you can listen to the soundtrack just as a musical piece instead of just having the movie there in front of you.
Yeah.
I think John Williams, as great as he is, a lot of his music, it just like the Mickey Mousing of everything, it needs to accompany that. And the themes are what stand out, what you can listen to separately as concert pieces. But Zimmer, just as a soundscape, I think it's great that you can, and maybe it's not this way for anybody, but as far as all composers go, that's the one composer that I can listen to his scores separate from the movie, and still it feels like a complete musical experience. It sounds like, you know what I mean? So
I completely get that. I mean, I've been basically in love with film music for about 30 years now. And it's one of those things where and you're right, as much as I love Williams, I don't find myself listening to his soundtrack as much separate from the film as now. There are some. I mean, I will occasionally put on a Star Wars or even something like AI or some of his more some of his less conventional scores, or I mean, something like Catch Me If You Can, I think is an excellent score that you could listen to separate from the film and really get an appreciation for the film. But yeah, I mean, it's something, even, with something like Saving Private Ryan, I mean, that's another good example. I mean, at least Him for the Fallen, I think, is a good standalone piece. But, like, so much of that is tied to the images, and maybe it is something to be said about Zimmer and some of the choices he's made over the years that you don't necessarily get that same connection with some of those images. The thing about Backdraft is, like you said, the use of the horn when the You Go, We Go line happens near the end. And Show Me Your Fire Truck, which is a great cue. No, it's really terrific. And yeah, I do, like I said, I mean, I find he's kind of a go-to as far as me listening to his scores. And I think that's one of the things that when I started to get into his music, I could pop in pretty much any soundtrack and kind of get lost in it. And I mean, whether I've seen the movie or not, and there are still soundtracks of his that I haven't seen the movie, but I feel like it's the soundscape aspect. And I mean, that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about my three choices is that they all kind of fit within that idea of being soundscape.
Yeah.
Some of them don't necessarily rely on themes as much as the overall feel of the musical work.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I don't mean to downplay John Williams because, again, it wasn't until Backdraft that like I said, noticed scores. You can listen to Empire Strikes Back has to be one of the greatest music scores of all time, just because he added to the already iconic, Star Wars theme and the Jedi theme and the Force theme and all that stuff, with additional themes for Han and Leia, for Yoda, he even has for Darth Vader, obviously. And then he even has a motif for the droids. Like he has Empire Strikes Back is incredible. We saw that with the Utah Symphony. Those symphony, the players, man, like the concert guys, just take them out, like all the players are, because they must have been sweating. And that's one of those scores that you can listen to separately because it creates like, the soundscape we're talking about. And then with Private Ryan, the music score is interesting because Hymn to the Fallen's a great score, and it's revered, and I give it a moment of silence whenever it comes. You pay your respects to it, but I don't think that there's music score that comes in until maybe they're at the village at the end when they find Matt Damon's character, and then they're trying to rebuild and trying to set traps, and then the music comes in. You're like, oh yeah, like I don't know if I've heard the score before, because it's accompanying. It's the images speak for themselves, so you don't need. I think one of the, like we talked about Mickey Mousing or John Williams gets a little bit too saccharine sometimes. One of the criticisms of Hans Zimmer is that his music is noticeable. I think a lot of people don't necessarily like that they notice the music more than the movie themselves because it stands out. But I don't know, that's one of the things that I like about it. Like you notice that music, especially with, if you're comparing 80s, like we talked about Rad having there's no accompaniment to make that last little bit kind of exciting, the big rah moment. It's kind of the same with the original Top Gun, like the Harold Faltermeyer score, which is, again, iconic in its own right. But I don't think the score really does a perfect job of that last dogfight of making you feel like the impact of it.
Yeah.
But if you look at Top Gun Maverick, the way that Zimmer's contribution to that score, it builds the tension so that when they're having the dogfighting at the end, the baseline drive, the emotional drive of that score, it really makes you feel the impact and the power of what they're going through, what they're up against. And that's one thing that I love about movie music is it can help push you that extra level, as opposed to if they did Private Ryan nonstop saccharine score, it would have been too much. The weakest parts of that movie are the bookends, in the present. It's too saccharine, a little too sweet to really make it as good as the Schindler's List or up there. But everything in between is so strong and it's so dark and it's so powerful that you don't need the accompanying music for it. I think that's an interesting point because sometimes music is just as impactful without it as with it. And Zimmer, I think, some of the scores that you chose are very accompanying, but very mood setting and very ambiance like. And you need that as opposed to something that stands out like a rock score.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think part of that, and I wonder if so much of that with Zimmer, because of the fact that he started to really get identified with action movies in the late 80s, early 90s, you have to have music that can go up against all of the sound effects that you're up against in an action movie. And right. I feel like that's part of it, but at the same time, if a movie, there's certainly times where a score's insistent is noticeable to the point of being too insistent. Yeah. And I think even Zimmer sometimes has that happen to him. But I mean, it's not necessarily his fault. It's the movie in general. But at the same time, I think when you have somebody like Zimmer who is creating the music, and it's, look at The Lion King, which was his first Oscar nomination. There are moments in that to a certain extent you would think, oh wow, that's too much. But really it isn't, because of the fact that the emotional impact of what his music is doing in that score is just it takes the film to a completely different level.
Yeah. There's the I can't, like, it's called This Land on the release soundtrack. But where he confronts Mufasa's ghost in the clouds, that's a really powerful, and Zimmer lays that theme throughout. So the first time you see Simba as a child, they play, or before that when it's Rafiki, he's painting the wall, you hear that This Land theme, or the father-son theme, we'll call it. But when it fully hits, when he's chatting, they're talking together, it's like, you must take your place in the circle of life. And the ghost disappears and Simba chases after it, like, don't leave me, and all that stuff. It's so powerful the way that it builds. And that's, again, you're talking about, that's too much, but for that moment of mythic quality, I think in Lion King, that's definitely a standout, amongst all the other, like the Lee Bowen contributions and all the African chanting and stuff that adds to the sonic soundscape of the movie itself. That's definitely a mythic, powerful moment that works because of that music. And that's something that, again, all great music scores do, regardless of the composer. Zimmer's had his weaknesses, he's had his strengths, but when he hits, I think he hits really, really hard and really well.
Yeah. And, so a couple of years after he won an Oscar for The Lion King, in 1995, he had his score for Tony Scott's Crimson Tide, which many consider one of his greatest. And it's one that Steven Spielberg loves so much. He even said at one point, if it wasn't for his collaboration with John Williams, he would want to work with Hans Zimmer. And it's not a coincidence that Hans Zimmer and his group at Media Ventures, which was the studio at the time that he did, that was really a collective of composers. It was basically a music studio solely for film and TV music, and was a collective of composers. Plenty of names that people are familiar with: Mark Mancina, Trevor Rabin, John Powell, Harry Gregson Williams, Nick Lenny Smith, Rupert Gregson Williams. Jay Rifkin was a collaborator in that process. He was one of the producers of that. Crimson Tide is a tremendous score, but it was one that came out in 1996 that was the one that really made me stand up and take note and listen, sort of in the same way Backdraft was for you, and that was Zimmer scored for John Woo's Broken Arrow. Yeah. And this was, by this point, I knew that I wanted to try write music for film. And I listened to, I've written about before, James Horner's score for Braveheart was one that, ever since I'd really started to get into film music, the more I listened, the more I'm like, oh, this is great. And that was kind of a 1-2 punch of the Crow and Braveheart that made me like, man, what if I could do something like that? I mean, I was in band in high school, and trombonist, and and Broken Arrow was in my senior year, and by this point, I basically had already decided that I kind of wanted to continue pursuing music, and the thing that I love about Broken Arrow, and first of all, one of the things that completely blew me away about Broken Arrow was when I got the soundtrack after we watched the movie for the first time. You look at the musician credits. There were 8 credited musicians on Broken Arrow, and I'm like, how on earth can only 8 people create that depth of music? And it was my first time of really paying attention to electronic music. And the synthesizer use, and the thing that I love about Broken Arrow, the thing that I still continue to go back to as far as Broken Arrow, is the fact that, yes, it's very much a lot of the same things that he did in Backdraft. It's a lot of the same things he did in Crimson Tide. But there's an aspect to the score for Broken Arrow that I think is really makes it stand out, much like the horns do in Backdraft, and that is the use of the guitar by Dwayne Eddy, who famously did the Peter Gunn theme, and Hans Zimmer got him to perform the guitar in Broken Arrow. I love that guitar theme in this movie really signifies a level brotherhood between Travolta and Christian Slater's character, and something that we both love John Woo, and so we know from like The Killer, from Hard Boiled, the people on two sides of a different coin, the friendship, brotherhood, that type of thing loyalty is important to him. And even though Broken Arrow is not even, I wouldn't even say it's in his top 3 as far as his American films.
Yeah.
It's still an entertaining movie, and a big part of that is the way he uses the theme by Dwayne Eddy to really hammer home the brotherhood between Travolta and Slater's characters as they first separate, because Travolta's character is the villain, and then you hear that throughout the film, and it's just in the use of Western ideas. One of the scores that he's cited as being a big inspiration for him was the late great Ennio Morricone, and in particular Once Upon a Time in the West, as well as The Mission. And I think you can really tell the influence on Broken Arrow in stuff like The Mission and Once Upon a Time in the West.
Yeah, you Broken Arrow, like Backdraft. Broken Arrow is not the John Woo came over from Hong Kong. I think Hard Target, like Jean-Claude Van Damme, brought him over and tried to make an impact. Hard Target's not a smart movie. Broken Arrow's not a smart movie. Like, you could talk about The Killer and Bullet to the Head and Hard Boiled as being really smart, really supple, like action movies that aren't just about the action. I think Broken Arrow came along, and it's when I say dumb, I don't mean to say that it's it makes the movie like terrible or anything like that. It's not as smart. It's dumb compared to the other like smarter movies that he's made.
Yeah.
But I think audiences weren't necessarily maybe ready for the full woo. You know what I mean? As far as I think Broken Arrow kind of opened the door for Face Off, which is a very, very, in some ways, I think Face Off might be my favorite John Woo movie, just because of the way it's able to mix the American and the Hong Kong aesthetic, and the way that you talk about the brothers aspect of Broken Arrow. It's there, but I think the music does a lot more work for it than the screenplay does.
Yeah.
As opposed to Face Off, which it's very strong, that dichotomy between the hero and the villain, the killer or the hard boiled. That brother kind of aspect is very strong in those movies. It's not quite as strong in Broken Arrow, but I like to call Broken Arrow Exploding Helicopter the movie, because if there's a helicopter in it, it's going to explode. It's that kind of dumbness. But it has the Dwayne Eddy theme. I think Hale, the Christian Slater, he has a great hero theme, the part where he's being heroic and all that. So again, it's a very noticeable score. I don't know. Do you think, and there's another aspect of it, I think, but I want to come back to it, as far as Zimmer incorporating maybe other composers' scores in his scores. But as far as Broken Arrow goes, Brian, let me ask you, do you think that it's such a good score because it stands out against, again, the dumbness of the movie itself? Do you think that's why the score works so well, because it's so much better than the movie itself?
I think that's part of it. I think also, even though it's very much in the same vein of action scores like Crimson Tide and Backdraft, if you really listen carefully, you can tell the nuances in the types of synthesized sounds that Zimmer uses. And I mean, Crimson Tide definitely evokes being underwater for me. The score for Crimson Tide really evokes being underwater, being in a claustrophobic setting. Backdraft definitely feels like firefighters fighting a fire. Broken Arrow, because of the fact that so much of it takes place in the desert, I think there are moments where the synthesizers go up and down. There's this constant movement in volume and rhythm that I think is really interesting. And I think it's part of the reason why it really stood out to me even more than Crimson Tide, which I had seen by this point. But it was that, like, there are times where Wu pans across the landscape, and as you hear Zimmer's music, like, you feel like you feel like you're painting even if you're just listening to the music, you feel like you feel like the musical landscape is moving with the camera. And, whether it's using reverb, whether it's using crossfades and different types of musical and audio techniques like that, I think is really interesting. And again, you go to the theme, the idea, and by this point, I really had not gotten into Ennio Morricone's Spaghetti Western. That was still a couple of years off for me. But you definitely, I think it's one of those things that's just that type of sound just really engaged me because of the fact that it's like, oh, so it's not just, and I think part of it is it's not just the music that's creating this impact on me. It's the way the music is created, the way the music is recorded, the way the music is mixed is such a big part of it. And it's one of the things that when I got into electronic music in college, that's one of the things that really is kind of interesting is what can you do on a technical level to make your piece more interesting? And I think that's something where you don't really have that luxury writing for an orchestra because the orchestra instruments have limitations. The musicians have limitations. Now, granted, yes, you can change things up in post during the mixing process, but you don't want to go too far with it to where it feels unnatural or it sounds unnatural. With synthesizers, you definitely have that luxury of creating something otherworldly.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that perspective. Again, I'm not a composer like you, so I can listen to a music score and appreciate like the sound as far as it affects my ears. But as far as you talking about how the music works, that's something that I find fascinating as a different perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially in here, I mean, the way that he uses drum machines for the rhythms, the way that the rhythms aren't, they sometimes build to his crescendo along with the rest of the music. The fact that it's very much, it's one of those cases where you have a synthesized, like with Backdraft, you can kind of tell that there's a level of orchestral feel that he's trying to do with that. One of the things that is has always been so entertaining for me with Broken Arrow is that he kind of drops that idea of, oh, this is going to be and Crimson Tide's kind of the same way. There's some orchestral aspect to that he is bringing to that to turn it to life. Broken Arrow is feels almost purely electronic. I mean, yeah, there's guitars, there's horns that play throughout it, but at the same time, the biggest changes in the overall soundscape come from synthesizers. They don't come from mimicking orchestral sound. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about it.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about the orchestral sound, the electronic, like Backdraft has like a choir that comes in, and that makes it feel more symphonic or orchestral than electronic. Crimson Tide has that too. It has the men's choir that sings along with it. Makes it feel apart from playing on a synthesizer or a keyboard, something like that. I think the Duane Eddy guitar kind of has that same effect. It's not. Yeah, the rest of the music score is electronic, but the Duane Eddy guitar kind of gives that human quality to it, which kind of maybe works ironically because the Deakins character, the Travolta character, is not, again, he's the villain. He's kind of over-the-top comic booky type of villain, and so it lends him kind of a humanity that's not really there in the performance or the script.
Yeah.
But that definitely works. But the other thing I wanted, and I don't know, like if you know this, but like, so the regular release of the Broken Arrow soundtrack was just released. It was great, like 7 tracks or something. And then La La Land released a complete score, and it's interesting because they credit at the bottom, they say includes samples from Fire in a Brooklyn Theater by Randy Edelman. which isn't on the original. So I'm not sure if you knew the story. I think, and the theme that we're talking about from Edelman, it comes from a movie called Come See the Paradise. I think it was a Pearl Harbor movie. But it has, and it's played in a lot of trailers. It's played in the Two Good Men trailer.
I'm familiar with that. Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, so the dead-end, you know, that one, that does, you can hear it in the Broken Arrow score, but I don't know if that credit on the soundtrack was maybe Edelman or the studio that released Come See the Paradise maybe sued Broken Arrow or raised kind of a stink, and so they had to credit it. So I don't know if he perfectly sampled it like he sampled Sunshine, John Murphy's score. There's a track, Adagio in D minor or something like that. He sampled for Wonder Woman 1984, and which is definitely credited. But I don't know if the Edelman track, if that's the case. Do you know anything about that?
So, you know, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me if there was a legal issue. And yeah, you can kind of hear that sample at certain points in the movie. But I mean, you know, and that is a very famous trailer score. It's like if you've heard like there are half the thrillers in the 1990s have that music in the trailer.
Right.
No, I would imagine it was something. I would imagine it was a legal issue. You know, where it's like you basically, you know, I don't know that there were any specific legal issues that I've ever read about it, but you know, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me. I mean, Ligeti sued Kubrick for the way he manipulated some of his music in 2001 during the Stargate sequence. So, I mean, you know, but that was much more high profile because of the fact that, you know, it was very obvious and it was very public. So, I would imagine it was a legal issue because, I mean, you know, look, as much as I admire Zimmer as a composer, as a businessman, as somebody who has made a living as a film composer and has done something quite innovative as a film composer, or not so much innovative, but something that we don't necessarily see too much nowadays in terms of mentorship and all of that. You know, there have been legal issues with Media Ventures. I mean, Media Ventures basically turned into remote control because basically composers were not necessarily getting credit for their work the way they probably should have been. And you know, I mean, that's part of the reason why some scores of his you see like 2 to 3 names on it, because of the fact that it's like, you know, they kind of had to do that, but at a certain point. But at the same time, I mean, you know, I do love. I mean, I think especially with the type of music that Zimmer does, it's sometimes easier to make those type of influences a little bit hidden, and those type of samplings a little bit hidden. But I mean, you know, it really that's one of the things that we also see in the 80s and 90s that we start to see, the idea of sampling. And I mean, it's more and more it's more prominent in popular music and genre like rap and hip hop and pop music. But at the same time, it's not unexpected that you would feel that something like that would happen in film music either, especially when you're talking about electronic scores.
Yeah, I bring that up not to say that Zimmer like plagiarized that score, because obviously you have so many music scores and you're influenced by so many things. I think if you're talking even directors, Spielberg or Scorsese or De Palma or Lucas, they're influenced by so many movies that they incorporate images that are in their brains into their movies, even though they're copied almost exactly from other movies. That's not plagiarism. It's just they're being informed by, you know, other movies. And so I don't bring the Randy Edelman thing up in Broken Arrow to say, oh, look at Zimmer plagiarizing. I just think it's interesting that maybe he didn't, you know, and there's the trailer, it was famous by then, obviously.
Oh God, yeah.
But I don't know if Zimmer necessarily heard that and thought, oh, look, let me incorporate that into the music score, and I'm not going to credit it at all. I just think that it was so similar that they're like, hey, if you're going to do that theme, I think we need to come back and we need to have at least some kind of credit on it. So again, it's not a detriment to that score at all. I just thought it was interesting seeing that as a credit.
Oh
ever
no!
Since that La La record.
Oh no! There's actually another one of the film scores we're going to be talking about where, it's actually kind of interesting the way the way my ear hears something, but we'll get to it at that point. So also this year he collaborated on The Rock, he collaborated on The Whole Wide World, and he also got his third Oscar nomination for The Preacher's Wife in the original musical or comedy score, and which he would actually be nominated for 3 times in the existence of that category. The next year he would be he would be nominated for As Good as It Gets. But he also had another film that came out, and it's also one of your soundtracks, and it is for Mimi Letter's The Peacemaker.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I chose The Peacemaker over Crimson Tide. Is obviously one of my favorite scores. Like you said, it's one that brought Spielberg's attention. I think it's helped Zimmer become like head of like the music production at DreamWorks. That kind of got him that position. And The Peacemaker incorporates bits of Crimson Tide. I think the main theme sounds like Crimson Tide. Incorporates bits of The Rock and incorporates bits of. You talk about Dwayne Eddy doing guitar. I think he had Pete Haycock performing the guitar on Thelma and Louise and K2 and Drop Zone. So The Peacemaker kind of incorporates that sound. Again, Zimmer had a very noticeable or very recognizable aesthetic or sound for his action movies during the 90s. I just think The Peacemaker, I wanted to talk about that because it has, again, one of my favorite action cues of all time. But nobody's heard of The Peacemaker. It was DreamWorks, like, I think it was their first, was it their first movie?
It was their first live action, yeah.
Okay, it's first, along with, and then Mouse Hunt came soon after, and Prince of, they had that big string of releases, but Peacemaker, again, talking about movies, it's not great. Like, it doesn't rewrite any rules. It's a very solid, like, techno, like military thriller. It works as an action movie. I think it works just fine. Mimi Letter's direction. One thing that's important in action is the geography. Like, you're able to tell what's going on. And she does a very good job at that. Again, there's nothing bombastic about the movie. She's very straightforward. But the centerpiece sequence of that movie, it's the chase where the DeVoe character, the Clooney character, is chasing after one of the nuclear bombs, or they think it's all the nuclear bombs that have been stolen. And they're chasing that convoy. The music that plays, and a bit of a side note here, Zimmer, the thing that's annoying but also great about him is when he releases his soundtrack, he does this thing where he doesn't release cues in their complete form. He like combines like 3 or 4 different, and John Williams does that too to an extent, but and that's why it's great trying to find the bootleg scores or the complete scores for Zimmer, because you can get and figure out the pieces of what he meant to do as opposed to how it combines on the soundtrack. The actual soundtrack release for The Peacemaker, my favorite cue is combined. I think there's only 5 or 6 tracks on it, but it's called Chase, and it's the first half of a 17-minute cue on the soundtrack. But the way, and if you take it separately, I think in the bootleg, I think La La Land released a version of it too, but it's called Chase is the name of the cue in that. But the way that and again, you talk about how Zimmer has to have a score that rises above the noise and the sound effects. I think some of the score does get drowned out by that because it is an action movie. But when you listen to Chase as a separate cue, talking about movies that you can listen to just in your ears as opposed to having it works as a beautiful piece of action scoring because it builds from a very quiet place to a big bombastic place. It's obviously where you want to go with action movies. But it has you talk about the rule of threes, having themes or dialogue or bits of movies that come back 3 times, once to show, it's important, twice to show, once to introduce it, twice to show that it's important, and the 3rd time to hammer it home. I guess the easiest way to describe that would be from, the first Transformers movie, where it's what is that line that they say? It's like, no sacrifice, no victory.
Yeah.
They say it 3 times, and the 3rd time Sam Witwicky says it, it's, that's important. It's a theme that's there. And in Chase, what I love about it has 2 times the rule of threes happens. It has a hero theme that plays 3 times, that plays one at the beginning to introduce when DeVoe launch, when they get the okay to go after the convoy. It comes later when they survive a missile attack, kind of plays a little bit. And then it has the full bombastic theme at the end when they finally succeed. But then it has another theme that I call the action theme, where again it plays a little bit in the middle, and then it comes back kind of a little bit full, and then it kind of lays back and relaxes. And then again, before it builds to that final hero theme, it builds to a full bombastic. It's the da 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 da. It's that theme, and it plays 3 times in it. It doesn't blow its whole wad. At the beginning, it plays a little bit, and then it plays a little bit more, and then at the end, it plays like the full-on action theme, and it's building to its climax. As a piece of action scoring, I don't think you appreciate it when you're watching the movie itself, because you're kind of caught up in the images, but separate, that's what I'm talking about. It's like, as a piece of music, as a cue, it works as, it builds to something. It has motifs that come back. It's very well structured. If you can find that on YouTube, it's just called Chase. And again, it kind of doesn't really butcher it on the actual soundtrack piece, but it kind of takes out a lot of the other bits and pieces that I like. But like I said, as a piece of action scoring, I think it's just a beautiful piece of work, and it's a standout. When my in-laws watched the Peacemaker for the first time, my wife made a point to tell them, oh, this is the piece that Darren really likes a lot, so pay attention to the music when you watch them. Like, I talk about it so much, and it means so much to me as an action piece of music that, I don't know, just stand up, but you don't, like I said, you don't necessarily notice it when you're watching it. So
yeah. I mean, I haven't seen the Peacemaker since the theatrical, and I don't know, for some reason I did not pick up this soundtrack at the time. But yeah, I searched it out when you said that this was going to be one of your choices, and yeah, I agree completely about the way that it rises and falls in the way a great action score does. I mean, yeah, I mean there are moments where it's derivative of like Crimson Tide, Broken Arrow.
Yeah.
It's very much of that era of Hans Zimmer music, which I'll admit I actually kind of love. I love his music for Drop Zone and stuff like that. I mean, I think it's entertaining.
It's a propulsive effect. It's a very propulsive kind of sound. Yeah.
Oh, that is absolutely the best way of putting it. And yeah, there are some really entertaining cues on there, and yeah, it's fascinating to hear to listen to soundtracks, because I mean Crimson Tide only has like 5 tracks on it. Like, there are 2 tracks that are very small, and then like there's one track that's like 25 minutes long. Yeah. The K2 soundtrack always cracks me up because it's just like
there's 2 tracks.
Ascent and Descent. And it's one of those things where it's like I love the way that to a certain it's one of those things where I really kind of love the way that making a soundtrack album is almost as creative in a way as creating the score itself. And I mean, one of the things that I love about with Broken Arrow is that everything, like all of the pieces really sort of like bleed, there's not like natural on the original soundtrack recording, at least, there's not typical breaks in the music. Like, it keeps going, and it makes it very easy to just listen to it one after another, and keep that music going. The Peacemaker's the same way, and I definitely see what I definitely hear what you appreciate about that cue, and the propulsiveness is something that I've always been a big fan of when Zimmer does action. And I mean, it's funny because of the fact that we've had discussions off the podcast, and he did the Dark Knight trilogy with James Newton Howard, and although he was the only composer listed on The Dark Knight Rises. And it's funny because of the fact that you and I kind of have very different feelings on that one, because one of the things I really like about that one is that I like that it sort of hints back at this earlier aspect of Zimmer. Because, I mean, it doesn't feel as influenced by like Gladiator and that type of thing they would do later, but it does kind of feel like, it does kind of feel like in the vein of something like a Crimson Tide or Broken Arrow or Peacemaker in the way it uses the synthesizer.
Yeah, the Dark Knight Rises score we did. I have a hard time with that one because I love the Dark Knight Rises. Like that whole trilogy, like works for me as a Batman story, like an emotional journey. So when I bring up Dark Knight Rises, always like with a little hesitation because I know a lot of people don't like it. So it's always me bringing it up going, Dark Knight Rises, I like it a lot. You know, just kind of like preparing to be hurt. You know, like people are, what are you talking about? It's a terrible movie and it sucks. You know, that kind of thing. So I kind of back up, but I do love that score. I think it's just, as far as an original piece of music, it's not my favorite because I think they go into ascending. Batman Begins is my favorite for those, then The Dark Knight, and then The Dark Knight Rises. Just because, you know, Dark Knight Rises is obviously going to incorporate scores that have been done before, and Batman Begins set that soundscape that kind of pays off in the rest of the trilogy. But I think he treated, like, I think the interview, like he said he was going to treat the orchestra that was playing like a drum circle, he was going to beat them silly, he was going to make them like wear them out. It does have that feel, again, because Dark Knight Rises is a disaster, is the aesthetic of it. So they're able to, it's so oppressive. So I think that works for that movie. But I do like that what you said, it does harken back to that electronic sound. I don't mean to denigrate the Dark Knight Rises or its score. It's just that it means so, it's one of those things that means so much to me that it kind of hurts a little bit, even though I know everybody has their own opinion. It hurts a little bit when somebody doesn't like it because I like it so much. It's that kind of thing. But I don't mean to denigrate that score. Well, that's a very strong score. And again, it's very noticeable. The Bane theme is very noticeable. I like the Catwoman. I think it works. Like it has that metronomic soundscape, or the metronomic rhythm that he's famous for. Yeah. The Catwoman theme does have that. So again, very good score on that front. It's just not the one that made me fall in love with the Batman scores, I guess you could say.
No, and I think that's certainly fair. I mean, I think I prefer Dark Knight just because of the use of the Joker theme.
The way that he uses is like Jaws. Like that's the great thing of it. Like fantastic. When you hear it. Yeah, it's awesome.
And yeah, I've always been a big fan of Batman Begins too. I love that score. You know, and but going back to Peacemaker for a little bit, I mean this is one that I would definitely say is a bit of a gem. You know, and you're going to hear a little bit of similarities with some of his other scores, and but at the same time, I mean, I think the way that he builds to it makes me want, listening to the score makes me want to rewatch the movie, which I haven't seen in so long. But I mean, you can feel it. It's one of those things where, like you were, like we both said, it's like you can listen to this soundtrack and feel like you're getting a full experience, and you don't necessarily feel like you need the movie with it. And I think that's one of the things that's really kind of terrific about this score for the Peacemaker. I know I use YouTube Music. I know it's available there. I'm sure it's available on YouTube and elsewhere. If you're a fan of Zimmer, if you haven't listened to it in a while, definitely check it out. I think it's really a pretty interesting one.
But even if it like copies, like if it's derivative of it, I think there's an aspect of it where a director will sit down, kind of like Ridley Scott with Black Rain, where they're like, I want this sound. Like I love this movie. I love Drop Zone. Like say Mimi later will say to Zimmer, I don't know if they did, but I want this sound for this movie. And so they are purposely derivative because that's what the director wants. And if you see Zimmer's name on an action score, I think that's kind of what you want too. But yeah, I like that you call it a gem. It's something that hasn't been heard before. There's a lot of just beautifully structured pieces in that score that don't get the appreciation they deserve.
Yeah. 1998, he had a couple pretty big scores. One was another Oscar-nominated one for The Prince of Egypt, also in the original musical or comedy score, which, you know, it's funny, both, I mentioned earlier that, like, I got into the habit of purchasing soundtracks from Zimmer for movies I hadn't even seen before. I do vividly remember buying the soundtrack for both of these films, actually, before the movies came out. And the first one was Prince of Egypt, which got nominated in original musical or comedy. And the second one is my next choice for Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line, which was nominated in the dramatic score category. And probably should have won. I'm still I think it's funny because of the fact that like let's go off on a little bit of a tangent here. So after The Lion King, the Academy split up the original score category for a few years into dramatic score and a musical or comedy score. They did that for a few years because Disney was basically hoarding all the musical Oscars for score because it won for Little Mermaid, one for Beauty and the Beast, one for Aladdin, and one for The Lion King. I was thinking about it in preparation for this episode, and it's interesting that in the 8 years, in the 8 categories that the score category was split up, Miramax ended up winning 5 Oscars. So we had another sort of we had another sort of dominance, and the first year was split up. Pocahontas won musical or comedy, so they couldn't get away from Disney just yet. And then in dramatic score, we had Il Postino winning over Apollo 13 and Braveheart, among other scores. Complete travesty. I mean, I understand. And I'm so there are a lot of reasons to be pissed at the wine scenes in Miramax. This is one of the worst. Like this 4-year run of scores. So 1996, Miramax won for both Emma, which is a lovely score. I'm fine with it winning. And then The English Patient, which of course it was going to win. And it's a good score as well. 97, well, that was the year of Titanic, so of course James Horner won. And then the Full Monty won Best Comedy Musical Score, which is still a bit of an anomaly. Because the score was not what people were coming out of that movie appreciating.
Is that the only award that the Full Monty won? Is that why they gave it that?
I think that's what it was. And I think to a certain extent in that era, I think the original score was kind of an easy win to give like movies that were nominated for Best Picture and stuff like that weren't really going to win anywhere else. But yet, in 1998, so the year that Zimmer was nominated for both Prince of Egypt and Thin Red Line, musical or comedy was Shakespeare in Love, which as much as I love Prince of Egypt, as much shit as Shakespeare in Love gets, Stephen Warbeck does a beautiful score in that movie. I talked about the movie on Binge Movie. And it's a wonderful score.
Yeah, I love it.
I will never in a million years understand how The Thin Red Line and Saving Private Ryan lost the Oscar to Life is Beautiful. And I love Life is Beautiful more than other people. But I will never in a million years understand why that won the Oscar for score.
Yeah, the Oscars you don't want to get me going on that. They're just a weird, with Disney winning, it's just kind of, let's just give it to them. I don't know, like when I listen to Aladdin and compared to like The Lion King, Beauty and the Beast is great. Little Mermaid is great, obviously, because that made a huge dent. But as far as Aladdin, it's fine, but I don't know if it's as strong as, say, The Lion King. I think, they did settle. And then with Miramax winning, it's all about the money that you spend. It's all about the promotion. Like the Weinsteins were just fantastic at that, to the point where, talking about The Dark Knight, like they pushed for The Reader to be nominated over The Dark Knight, which is, The Reader is not a good movie. I don't think it really worked. But, and there's obviously enough work for there. But Oscars are very... I didn't even know who won this score. I didn't even know that Zimmer was nominated for Prince of Egypt and Thin Red Line, which were deserved. But as far as Life is Beautiful, I probably like that movie a lot less than most people like it. So we're kind of on opposite perspectives there. But again, that's a Miramax thing. It's about buying it. And it's interesting with Full Monty winning, because again, let's give it to something because people like Full Monty. Let's just give it a best musical score, not kind of thing. It's interesting. You talked about Thin Red Line. That's the main one that I mentioned before, being very ambiance. And as the opposite of Saving Private Ryan, which I think the images sell the movie more than the score does. You don't need the score to really do it. And the score seems, I would have been fine if they didn't introduce the score until the very end, like have no score and then have him to fall and play over the credits.
Yeah.
That might have been interesting. But Thin Red Line, because it's such a poetic kind of look at the way war affects people and affects nature. That's the whole point of that movie. And if you're looking at our list of 6 movies, I think Thin Red Line is probably the greatest movie in either of our lists. That's actually a great, great movie. I don't know if I necessarily like it as much as Private Ryan because it's more, Thin Red Line, you could look at it and think of it as like too pompous or too self-important because, again, the voiceovers and the way the music is. I think it works because of what Malick's going for. But as far as a soundscape, I think that's a beautiful score for the mood that it creates. I don't know if you can, apart from Journey to the Lion, which is the famous one from that is, again, has been featured in many trailers. I don't know if you could take a lot of that and listen to it as kind of let's put it in my car and like rock out to it. It's more of like a classical piece of music. I think they just listen to it and let it's ambience and wash it over.
No, you're absolutely right. And no, this was one that I knew I definitely wanted to include in this because it is one that it felt like Zimmer's music going to a completely different level. And one of the things I love about all 3 of my scores here is that they all really do feel like soundscapes in a lot of ways. I haven't seen Thin Red Line since theaters. I do need to revisit because of the fact that I have much more of an appreciation for Malick now than I did when the Thin Red Line came out. So I'm curious to see if I feel differently about it because I thought it was fine, but yeah, the voice, like you talked about, the voiceover just really kind of took me out of the movie with so much of it. So with the Thin Red Line, I actually pulled out one of my old mixed magazines, which was one of the magazines I subscribed to in college to learn about recording and stuff like that. They did a piece on the sound for the Thin Red Line, and included music or include the discussion on the music, which Zimmer famously worked tireless on. I think I read they wrote like 6 hours of music or something at some point.
I think he wrote it before. I think Malick asked him to write the score, and so he wrote pieces, and then Malick played it on set.
It's very much the Ennio Morricone approach to film music, which, I mean, Morricone, like, they played Ecstasy of Gold on the set of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly during that scene. But yeah, so up until the end, he was writing new orchestral cues, recording taiko drums, and sing beside Malick in the editing room with picture editors Billy Weber, Leslie Jones, and Sarah Klein, and he handled it all with grace. It was saying about how Zimmer arguably had the most pressure on him as that film was coming to the finish line. We never really had a spotting session. The way it started, which seemed like a good idea at the time, was that I would write music first and Terry would cut the picture to the music. We are doing that sometimes, and sometimes we're not. It's been intensely collaborative, and it's been wrought with frustration because you're striving for that level of excellence and simplicity and truth. I think the idea of simplicity and truth is central to the Thin Red Line score. I think it even if I don't necessarily, I feel like if you gave me, and I really kind of wish we had gotten this on the Criterion disc. I don't think they did this because, I mean, it's not really something that people have done on disc. But if you'd given me an isolated score with that movie, I think I could just watch John Toll's Images and listen to the score and just be completely transported. I might feel strongly about what Malick was trying to accomplish with the idea of the impacts on war and humanity on nature. And I feel like I might have felt that way even more than I did in his film. You mentioned Journey to the Line, which of course is the most famous cue from this movie.
And probably the most famous example of that metronomic rhythm. That we
Yeah.
mentioned before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I actually shared a piece that I wrote back in 1999, shortly after this score came out, called Ethereal Atmospheres, which was very much inspired by this.
Great piece.
Yeah,
Great piece, Brian.
There's a little bit of Thin Red Line inspired. There's a little bit of Beyond Rangoon, which was another score of Zimmer's that I was listening to at the time because of the use of the pan flute in that piece. And then there was this piano aspect that I actually kind of lifted from James Horner's score for Ransom to show you just how much my early musical work was inspired by film music. It was kind of a Frankenstein monster, but I really love that piece, and it's not something I feel like I've done stronger work since, but I think this shows it's an example of my love for film music coming out, and I'm grateful to be able to present that piece in a way, and I'll tack it on to the end of this podcast for you to listen, although it's available elsewhere, where you can listen to the inspiration, but I was able to manage to make it its own piece as well. That's one of the things that I love about the Thin Red Line score, is that it has these ideas of Asian sounds, of ethnic sounds that really come into play that we've heard in stuff like Rain Man and The Power of One and World Apart and Rain and The Lion King and Black Rain, but it's done in a different context. It's done in a much more ethereal context. And this is another one like Broken Arrow. Like, that one is a more visceral soundscape to listen to. This is a more ambient, like you said, it's a more ambient one. And it washes over me like a great piece of classical music. Yeah. And it's like listening to classical music. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate, is that it felt like Zimmer pushing himself in a way that he felt like he needed to challenge himself.
Yeah, well, it's Terrence Malick. I think Thin Red Line was his big comeback after Badlands was first, and then Days of Heaven, and then he didn't make another movie for like 20 years. So that was like his big comeback. So obviously you want to be, it's a great honor. And then obviously, speaking of, like, because Zimmer had associated with Malick before, because I know that he, for everybody likes the theme for True Romance, right? That You're So Cool theme. But when you listen, and again, Badlands was a huge, Bonnie and Clyde, obviously, but Badlands was a huge influence on True Romance, especially the way that it, the story plays out. And it's interesting when you watch Badlands after watching True Romance, and you hear what was the Carl Orff, the Gossenhauer track that is used for Badlands is almost identical to You're So Cool. Mm-hmm. And I know we talked about like sampling and stuff like that before, but You're So Cool it's almost exactly the same. Like it's the same track. Yeah. So as much as I love You're So Cool, like whenever people talk about that, I'm like, yeah, but have you listened to the Gassenhauer? Because that's the actual thing, So that was just a little bit of an aside, but I always like bringing that up, because we're talking samples, people feeding into others. I think the Mission kind of has, for Morricone, feeds in the Thin Red Line more than a lot of other scores that Zimmer uses, or for that kind of thing. But as far as like writing the music for it and pushing himself and making these long concert pieces, or 6 hours, and then having Malick look at it and kind of chop it up from a 4-hour down to like a 3-hour movie, and I think the choppiness of the score works for the movie, because the movie is very choppy. It's taking different people and giving them reminiscing moments. So I think the score works beautifully as like poetic for that. But if you were to listen, I don't know, like you talked about a music only track. I don't know if it would sound, you know what I mean? Like, would it sound choppy because the movie itself is choppy?
That would be interesting. That's a very good point. That is a very good point. Yeah. And again, I haven't seen the Thin Red Line in almost 25 years now. So, it's something I definitely need to go back to. Definitely check out. Yeah, I mean, it could very well be choppy. For the reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah, you talking about it could work as a silent movie. You could just have images.
Yeah.
It's like, I agree with that. Like the one thing, sometimes that narration, okay. You don't like, obviously you're talking over things that I'm getting. That's my problem with a lot of narration. But as far as like a visual, I think it's visual poetry in Red Lion, just because of all the images, the juxtaposing, the war, and the beauty of nature and things like that, like we mentioned, is I don't know. I just think it works for that movie. But coming back, it would be interesting hearing it as a music only track to see how it sounds. And again, I think La La Land, mentioned them a lot. They did release like a 4-disc version of that soundtrack too, that you can hear a lot of the more complete intentions that Zimmer was going for.
Yeah, there was a second CD released like months after the original theatrical, the original soundtrack of it, that includes a lot of the chants that they built off of for some of the music. But going to Journey to the Line, we've both talked about how there are cues such as in the Peacemaker. You talk about how propulsive the chase scene is for the Peacemaker. Journey to the Line is propulsive in a very different way, because you have the rhythm that starts to build very gradually, and then as the strings start to come in, you start to feel more and more tension, and then it brings into this just pure explosion with the brass coming in and just absolutely hammering home the emotional impact. I mean, there's a reason this became a very famous cue to use in soundtrack, in trailers, because of the fact that it has that natural build to it. I mean, it's not the first time, it's not the last time something Zimmer would do that. I mean, there's of course the blah that he used in Inception, that very much started to seep into trailers at that point. But with Journey to the Line, it's just such another beast in general. And if you're a Patreon subscriber, actually, I did do an audio essay on the scores of Terrence Malick and talking about the different ones, because I do agree. Yes, of course, Malick was a big part of the reason for the challenge for Zimmer, but one of the things that I really started to notice as I was listening to the scores for his films more after Hidden Life, which I absolutely adore, is the way you have composers as varied as Ennio Morricone for Days of Heaven, Hans Zimmer for the Thin Red Line, James Horner for The New World, and James Newton Howard for Hidden Life, who it's almost like they're all at the surface or Alexander Desplat for Tree of Life.
Yeah.
And they all are very individualistic composers in their own right, but with Malick seems to be the ultimate creative force behind those scores. Yep. Because you can tell different things that keep popping up in those scores, different ways of composing. And yeah, it's certainly a challenge for the composer, but for the filmmaker to almost be as much of the author of those scores as the composer is. It's really kind of fascinating to listen to his the scores for his films in that context. And so if you're a Patreon subscriber, check that out. I released it a couple of years ago during the pandemic. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think something that's interesting is, playing Zimmer's music on set, kind of get everybody in the mood. And then everything with Malick is kind of a plaything. When he's editing the movie together, the music becomes secondary to kind of to support the images. And because like you said, he's the driving force. So the intention of the composer, I know that Zimmer tried to write motifs for different characters in there, but then when you fully remove like an Adrian Brody character or stuff like that in the editing process, it becomes less about the composer's intentions. It's purely about the director's intentions. Yeah. That's a very interesting point as far as Malick goes. choosing composers like that and then chopping them up. It's definitely a choice.
Oh yeah, definitely. And yeah, I love the Thin Red Line. I still love that score. It's one that, like, there were a couple I was kind of toying with. There was another one that I was kind of toying with. They did for a documentary series called Millennium that I really love, and it really ties into more of a lot of the African type influence of his music. And I love that score still, but I wanted to choose the Thin Red Line because I feel like with the change in his perspective and the way he changed his sound around for that is such an extreme. And it's such a worthwhile thing to talk about. You know, we didn't, you know, so we're going to move forward in history, and a couple of years later he would get another Oscar nomination for his score for Gladiator, for Ridley Scott. And it's wild that as much as I love his score for Gladiator, I am so glad Tandon won for Crouching Tiger and Dragon. I think that was a worthy winner. But the thing that always makes it so wild for me with Zimmer was that in May of 2000, he had Gladiator, and then a few weeks later, he had his score for Mission Impossible 2. And I know you and I both wanted to talk about this one because of the fact that, look, Mission Impossible 2 is not a good movie. It's really not. Like, it's fine, but it feels like somebody parodying a John Woo movie more than a John Woo movie. But Zimmer's score, this was his next collaboration with Woo, although he did produce John Powell's score for Face Off. This was his second collaboration with Woo, and there are things about it that I think are just as exciting to me to listen to as there are in Broken Arrow.
Yeah, if you were to talk again, that's definitely the lesser of all. I still like Mission Impossible 2 as far as it trying to be a James Bond ripoff. I think it works better than most James Bond movies. But you're right, it does rise to kind of parodic kind of levels with the doves and everything like that. But that score, and again, he worked with Lisa Gerrard on both Gladiator and this one. So you talked about Show Me Your Fire Truck being one of my favorite tracks. You're talking about You're So Cool being one of my favorite tracks. The Injection, which if you're talking about Mission Impossible 2 being a bad movie, the part that works, and I think works beautifully, is the part where, you know, Ethan and the Sean character are confronting each other finally again, talking about the brothers, the dichotomy, which doesn't, again, maybe works less well than it did in Broken Arrow and Mission Impossible 2, and that's definitely there. But when the Naya character comes in, and that track is all, because it's an action scene, right? As soon as she injects herself with the virus, all of a sudden Lisa Gerrard's vocals kick in. And the backstory of that is, I think John Woo wanted an action-oriented piece for that whole thing when Ethan's trying to fend off Sean's goons and things like that and trying to protect Naya at the same time. Yeah. He wanted a very action-driven cue, but Zimmer and Tom Cruise looked at it and said, this scene is about the Naya character. It needs to be her focus on what. Yeah. And you go through an hour and 20 minutes of not knowing who's on what side. And then finally it turns out that Naya's like, she's in it for Ethan and she's sacrificing this for him. And there's the part where he goes like, you know, I thought you said you weren't going to risk yourself. He's like, I wasn't trying to, I was just trying to keep him getting hurt. And the way that the action stuff drowns out and the action, like the gunfights are kind of muffled and the Gerrard vocals are very up, you know, front and center. It's a gorgeous piece of work because of the way that it backs off from what you'd normally expect. And it makes it very character driven. It's just a beautiful sound, beautifully, the idea of it. So again, say Mission Impossible 2 is a bad movie, which I'm not going to argue with you. But that scene in itself is a great scene and a great use of movie music in an otherwise not very good movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those, and it's one of those scenes where you see John Woo being John Woo. And this is like John Woo. This is the John Woo you know and love if you know and love John Woo.
It kind of works the same way that the Somewhere Over the Rainbows.
Is that the one for Face Off? I was going to say that as well because it works in the exact same way because of the fact that you have the slow motion and but the music comes up. and it really hammers home the emotional aspect of what this scene is about. And I, credit Zimmer and Tom Cruise for making him realize that it's like, no, this is the focus of the scene. And no, that scene is absolutely beautiful, and yeah, that music is absolutely wonderful.
I might have mixed it up. My memory is not what he used. It might have been the opposite way. It might have been Tom Cruise and Zimmer wanting the action heavy, and then Wu wanting the. Either way, no matter what, I think what they decided on for the movie, I think that's what works.
It was the right choice. It was absolutely the right choice. And this was a year. This was a run. This started another run for Zimmer of just very successful scores. He had done Gladiator. He'd done MI2, and then he had also the next year he would do Pearl Harbor and Black Hawk Down, and then he would not compose Curse of the Black Pearl because he was working on The Last Samurai, but he would eventually take over that franchise. But as he was taking over that franchise, he also, we talked about the Batman trilogy, the Dark Knight trilogy from Nolan, and that was his first collaboration with Nolan. And
another case of, I think Nolan asked Zimmer. I think Zimmer was really busy, and Nolan was like, "Could you write a piece for me so I can use it on set?" And so I think that was the chase scene sequence or set that he wrote. Nolan was able to use it either for editing or something like that before the music was even completed. So again, another case of that. There's a lot of that with Zimmer. Seems like.
Yeah, and then actually there was another franchise that he became a part of that is much more obscure now. Barely people don't really remember it, but it's and it was your third choice in Ron Howard's The Da Vinci Code, which he scored.
Yeah.
And I have to say I appreciate you choosing this one because it made me remember what I liked about that score and why it stood out to me so much. I mean, look, I love the music for the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. It's basically a lot of the same thing for 3+ movies, at least for the Gore Verbinski movie. I love the music, but it's essentially the same thing each time. The thing that I love about Da Vinci Code, and it's interesting that we have, and I'll have a question for you for this after, but the thing I love about Da Vinci Code is that there are parts of it that allow Zimmer to continue with that thriller aesthetic that he came to be known for in the 80s, 90s, and the aughts, but the way he uses religiously associated sound, like organ, like pipe organ, like choir, and that type of music, the Sanskrit in a lot of ways that we've heard Williams use before, and we've heard in The Shining. I forgot how distinct that score is. And I mean, part of it is because, again, it's another movie I haven't seen theatrical, and it's an okay movie. I mean, I know there are things to complain about with regards to Tom Hanks and the role, but I thought it was a decent thriller. But I do love, this is a case where Zimmer's music really elevates the film to a more operatic perspective that I think the movie does not really come up to. And my question is, because this is the second Ron Howard movie we're talking about.
Interesting.
Because all of these filmmaker, there are all of these filmmaker composer collaborations over the years that are revered. Obviously John Williams, Steven Spielberg, Tim Burton, Danny Elfman, Bernard Herrmann, Alfred Hitchcock. Who is there a composer, one director that you would say has that rapport with Zimmer?
There is one. It might be controversial to say so, especially for how people look at this director now. I know he's got a very strong collaboration with Ridley Scott, very strong collaboration with Tony Scott. They've got, again, we're using this word a lot, soundscapes, very good soundscapes. And Black Hawk Down is a great score, working in as the opposite of the Pearl Harbor over Sakharine. We won't talk about Pearl Harbor being a terror, but Black Hawk Down is like the opposite of Pearl Harbor as far as it not being Sakharine and being like very focused on the matter at hand. No matter how much people are like, oh, how come it doesn't incorporate like the enemy's perspective? It's just about the U.S. Marines perspective or whatever. Because that's the point of the movie. That's the whole focus of the movie. That's what makes it great. Whether you want it to be other things or not, that's the decision that they made. Again, Black Hawk Down is very good. Hannibal, the score they did after Black Hawk Down, again, very operatic, great score.
I forgot about Hannibal. I love it. There's a cue on Hannibal I absolutely love.
Which cue?
What's the name of it? It's got dialogue over it on the soundtrack. It's the gallows or the.
Let something be my gallows.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Let my home be my gallows. Right. Yeah. Gorgeous piece. Again, very. Again, opera, like symphonic kind of. I love that. So Ridley Scott's got a good rapport with him. I think, and then Penny Marshall, he worked with her a lot, and as with Preacher's Wife and League of Their Own and Riding in Cars with Boys and Renaissance Man. So again, he's worked with directors because they like going to him. But I think that maybe Christopher Nolan works. I love their work together just because of the way that you watch interviews with Nolan and you watch interviews with Zimmer and them talking about each other. Just the way that Nolan tries to push him, like the one. Your last choice we're going to talk about, like he asked Zimmer to write a piece, just giving him some dialogue and then writing the movie around that. So and obviously, Dunkirk being a character in itself, like the score being a character, again, the Batman scores, just pushing him and for new things and working with each other and working in tandem to make each other like better. I think they've got fascinating work together as far as like the highs and lows of their movies that they're working together and the way that people look at those. I think that it's just a fascinating kind of relationship that they have. What I don't know. What do you think?
I think Nolan is a really good choice. I definitely would. I do definitely think Ridley Scott's in the conversation. It's funny because of the fact that I was also thinking about Ron Howard because of the fact that we're talking about two of his films. But it goes beyond those two films with him and Zimmer because, the movie gets a lot of shit, but he also scored Hillbilly Elegy for Ron Howard. I believe he scored both of the sequels to Da Vinci Code.
Yep.
And he also did a terrific score in Rush.
Yeah.
And I think there's at least one or two more. But I think, for a long time I would have said, oh, well, the composer that Ron Howard has that collaboration with more is James Horner because of Apollo 13, because of
Willow,
Cocoon, Willow. But I think I think his collaboration with Howard is really kind of interesting. I mean, it's not to say that I think it's resulted in. Certainly, it hasn't necessarily resulted in the best work, I think, for either of them. I do think, I do think that, I think Rush is an excellent movie. Backdraft is a really strong movie. But I think there are some interesting things. It's almost like Zimmer is pushed Howard, I think, to a certain extent to sort of be darker in their collaborations together. And it's actually kind of interesting that that's the case.
Yeah, in the Heart of the Sea and Rush, I don't love Ron Howard as a director. I think he's more of a vanilla kind of director. He doesn't really have, other than the theme of family, like he doesn't really have a lot of personality. I'm going to say something controversial. I don't think his direction is fine for A Beautiful Mind, but I don't think that movie is very good. As far as everything goes, and I have my reasons for, we won't get onto that because it's a separate thing, but it's interesting talking about Ron Howard because if you go back to Backdraft, they did have that kind of conflict or that friction where Ron Howard wanted the dark black rain score and Zimmer wanted a more heroic. And so I think they had a history of like butting heads. And then with Da Vinci Code, it's funny because it didn't occur to me that they were both Ron Howard movies. I might have made a different choice if it came to that. But as far as me choosing that movie, I think Zimmer and Howard were in a conversation in some kind of function, that they were a celebrity function. And Zimmer asked Howard, "What are you doing next?" And Howard talked, "Oh, I'm doing Da Vinci Code." And Zimmer kind of made fun of him. "Oh, you're taking that book that like doesn't work as a movie, like just characters expositing in each other for like 400 pages. You're going to take that and make it into a movie." But then they started sparking up a conversation about where that was going. I did have a very specific reason for picking Da Vinci Code because it ties in with some Hans Zimmer controversy. But I don't know if it's relative necessarily his greatest score, one of his great scores. But as far as a music score, like you said, elevating a movie that's not very good and making it good, that is probably one of the prime examples. That the score for Da Vinci Code is so symphonic. Again, it's like a symphony piece. It's like a classical piece. And so Da Vinci Code is weird because it's such a silly movie to me. It's like, it's so Poe-based and it's so self-serious, but it's about like God, like laying treasure, like a treasure hunt to find and like puzzle pieces. And it's like so silly, and they're expositing at each other and just talking and then Ian McKellen shows up, and he's the saving grace of that movie because he shows up and he's got a glint in his eye. And it's like, yeah, this is dumb, but I'm going to treat it dumb and you'll have fun as opposed to the rest of it. I think there's even a car chase in the middle of the Da Vinci Code that they're being chased by nobody. And it's pulse pounded because they had to have something in there. It's so weird. But as far as the musical piece, it's weird because, and here's the reason I chose it, not because it's just greater than the movie itself, but Zimmer has a way, and the tracks on, I've got the soundtrack right here. It's got 14 tracks on it, and track 9 through 13, Poison Chalice, The Citrine Cross, Rose of Arimathea, Beneath Alwisha, and Chevalier de Sangreal. Zimmer wrote that as a concert piece. He wrote it as a 5-piece suite that they recorded the first day in the recording session. I think Ron Howard said something like that. So the record, again, it's like a symphony piece. It's like a classical music piece that Zimmer wrote. And it's gorgeous. Like every movement of that suite, it's something that Zimmer, again, he tried it with Batman Begins. He tried it with Hannibal, trying for that classical kind of tone. But I think he reached the height with that 5-suite piece that's just gorgeously paced. And what it does, and I think Zimmer does this a lot, is he'll write a big suite. I know he did it for The Ring. I know he did it for Dark Phoenix. He definitely did it for Da Vinci Code. And Pirates of the Caribbean, he even famously did that. He wrote the theme for it, even though Bedell took over composer duties. But he'll write a suite of themes, and then he'll use that suite to kind of pepper and separate and use throughout the rest of the movie itself. He uses that as kind of the influence of what he's going to write. But then a controversy with that is Zimmer, obviously, the big backlash of him is he's got all the people that work for him through Media Ventures and now Remote Control Productions, right? The names we talked about, the Powell and the Harry Gregson Williams and the Jablonski and the Benjamin Walsh that you just did Shazam. He's got this whole roster of people. But Zimmer's always accused of not writing his own stuff. You know what I mean? He's accused of kind of writing something and then giving it to his people, but he takes all the credit for it, even though on the marketing purpose it'll say music by Hans Zimmer, but then on the soundtracks he'll credit all the other people. And that's one of the things that got Dark Knight in trouble, because it had like 4 or 5 different composers, and the Academy couldn't vote it for some reason, because they're getting more money for the reader or whatever, but they couldn't nominate that. So there is that controversy with him writing a piece and then having his people write it. But in a way, it also gives his people a career. Like if it wasn't for Zimmer giving these pieces to people and letting them run with it, we wouldn't have all these other soundscapes, all these other composers who become great. I know Powell's great in his own right, but Delt's great in his own right. Jackman's kind of inching up there, Henry Jackman. So it gives his people another, so he's able to do that and give credit where credit is due. That's another reason why, because he wrote the suite, and then I think Da Vinci Code, he worked on it all himself, and that's what makes it. But that's kind of the tradition with him. You'll write a suite and then he'll hand it out, because he does 2-3 movies a year, which is hard for composers. But that gets a lot of controversy. But again, it has its drawbacks. It has its pluses.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think this is, and it's funny because a lot of the same things that are incorporated into Da Vinci Code's score, like the religious music aspect of it, really does kind of tie into my last score too. But I mean, one of the things I also want to do with this is I also do want to bring in like talk about other scores along the way. Because I mean, obviously not go into as much depth as we do with the six that we are talking about here. But he did The Holiday for Nancy Myers, which I love that score. It's a wonderful
Beautiful.
Score. The Simpsons movie. I love the score he did for the Simpsons movie. He did do Frost Nixon for Ron Howard as well.
Yeah,
and he did do both of the sequels to Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons and
Inferno.
Inferno. And then of course because of his Nolan, he got Inception, which also got an Oscar nomination for him. And then he also did the Sherlock Holmes movies, which we talked about those scores and absolutely love those scores.
Yeah.
He did Rango and The Weatherman for Verbinski as well. And then partially also because of the Nolan connection, he also did Man of Steel and started off with, and then did Batman versus Superman.
And wrote the Wonder Woman theme, which is probably the most iconic out of all the scores.
Yeah. And he also did The Lone Ranger with Verbinski, which, regardless of what you think about that movie, it's a tremendous score, I think. I think he did a really great job with that. And that brings us to 2014, which is when he released Interstellar with Christopher Nolan. And this is, I mean, depending on the day, this is my favorite Hans Zimmer score.
It's a good one. Very good one. Yeah.
And it's because of you mentioned the collaboration with Nolan earlier, and especially with the way that, Nolan basically gave him dialogue to compose to beforehand. And this to me is as impactful and as game-changing a score for Zimmer as The Thin Red Line. But it's something that's really interesting because of the fact that, in a way, it keeps with that classical idea that he was really diving into with The Thin Red Line, but in the way that it uses the church organ, which they record in an actual church in Germany, I think, if I remember correctly. It's absolutely beautiful, and that's the way that he uses that really envelopes the film in the same way as synthesizers do. And it's funny because of the fact that, so the one place you'll definitely hear this, and I basically pointed out because of the fact that it's really captured me ever since I heard this score, and I absolutely love this score. I really wish this had won him an Oscar. Of course, there are a few other scores that we've talked about along the way that I wish he'd won an Oscar for before finally getting his second one this year for Dune. It's on the soundtrack, it's Duck. And there's this motif that ends up being one of the main motifs where it's like, bum, 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 bum. And, you talk about these different motifs, and the one I'm thinking about goes, do, 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 do. I can't, for some reason, as a composer, I still have a hard time, doing melodies, but there's one that it's one of the ones that is very prominent in the score. It's funny because of the fact that I'm not saying anything one way or the other. I just, if he somehow listened to this and decided to incorporate this theme into his music, believe me, I'm more flattered than upset. But so in 2010, I released Beyond the Infinite, which is my personal soundtrack to 2001: A Space Odyssey. I gave myself that challenge in college, and it took about a decade to finally come into fruition. I was going to do an alternative soundtrack to 2001. Anybody who knows me, anybody who listened to the episode of Untold Cinema Gals where we talk about that soundtrack knows I adore that. it's foundational to me. But there's actually a motif that in some of my soundtrack for that it sounds similar to one of the motifs Zimmer does in Interstellar. And it's funny because they both are ambitious films about space travel, about going beyond what we currently know as far as science. And it's really, it was just, as soon as it hit me that was kind of similar, it's like, oh wow, that's it. I can't unhear it now. But it's like the idea that he might have heard my music at some point was like, oh, that's an interesting theme, and use it into score, which I absolutely prefer. It would be very flattering for me. But going to Interstellar, again, we have this idea of propulsion, like the sequence on the planet with Man, the Matt Damon character. The cue for that is it's just very consistently builds, and you've got that rhythm that we were talking about earlier, and then the organ and the orchestra comes in, and it's basically just building to this climax, and it's really just fascinating. So much of his scores really deal in propulsion in that way, and it's part of what makes them such a pleasure to listen to from a musical standpoint. But yeah, it's really kind of this score is absolutely wonderful. And then No Time for Caution is a tremendous score cue that really I can listen to that so much. It's just absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, that again with the metronomic rhythm. We talked about the religiosity between Da Vinci Code. I like how these are tying together. We talked about the religiosity between Da Vinci Code and Interstellar. I know that for Da Vinci Code, they recorded in Abbey Road Studios in London, I believe, because Harry Gregson Williams, I believe the backstory, Harry Gregson Williams worked on the score for Light and Witch in the Wardrobe, and Zimmer liked kind of the cavernous kind of feel, the religiosity of that score, and so that's why they recorded Da Vinci Code at Abbey Road Studios. With Interstellar, what I love about that score, I think there's literally an interview where Zimmer says we wanted to have a different soundscape than we'd had for the Batman scores and for Inception, where everybody's expecting the blam, kind of sound, and they wanted a different soundscape. And just having it play on that the organ, I think it's the Harrison organ, something like that, famously that they used. And again, that's religiosity in a nutshell, right? It kind of gets you the way that the thing. I think they describe it as like Zimmer like falling asleep on the keyboard and the note just building and building. But it works for the movie. And you talk about, we talked about how Nolan gave Zimmer, well, how would you score this if I just gave you the dialogue and he wrote him a piece? Interstellar is such a huge epic movie, and it's a giant science fiction, giant scope science fiction epic, that you need that human level. We can talk about the special effects. We can talk about what the Tesseract means at the end of that, and all that stuff that they're trying to aim for. But what really got me about that movie is, and the scene that kills me, because he leaves his daughter, and they're on that planet with the waves, and they're on the planet for like 7 minutes, and because of that, like 10 years or 12 years go by, and when they realizes that, the heartbreak of that. I mean, my kids, if I had to stay away from them for that long and weren't able to see them grow up, there's just something so heartbreaking about that. That's the heart of Interstellar, that I don't think the movie would work as well if it didn't have that humanness that I think Nolan was shooting for, that he wanted Zimmer to kind of, hit those notes, so to speak.
It was famous at that time because of the fact that, like, Nolan was upfront about it, where it's like, oh, he's trying to do something more emotional because of the fact that there was a knock about him being very clinical and is being very straight-faced and serious in terms of not really going for the big emotional beat. I mean, I think this, to a certain extent, I think at one point this was a movie that Jonathan Nolan and they were he was going to write for Spielberg.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense. So it's like, that was a huge conversation when this came out. But, and this, I think it's called Time, on the soundtrack. That and that moment where he's saying goodbye to his daughter, and it just breaks your heart and sticks with him, and she's pleading for him not to go, and that moment just is going to inform the entire movie. It's going to inform those characters throughout the rest of the movie, and it wouldn't work with Zimmer taking the same type of approach that they did on Inception or the Dark Knight trilogy. You needed something more contemplative and more quietly devastating along the lines of the Thin Red Line. And then, you have combining these two different ideas of sacred music, this quiet, emotional music that is basically like a prayer, and then this bigger, more outward, this outward expression of religious feeling from the pipe organ. And you would expect that this score would have choir all over it. Like, you could see that being the case, but it's all just orchestra and pipe organ. You don't need words. You don't need vocal words as a part of this score. It just is the way that Zimmer crafts this music and builds this music. That's where the emotion comes from. And Nolan you're right. I mean, Nolan really is that is the collaboration that I think Zimmer's going to be best remembered for. I mean, I think he's got interesting collaboration with Ron Howard. I think he's got great collaboration with Ridley Scott and Gore Verbinski. But it's going to be his collaboration with Nolan on the Batman movies, Inception, Interstellar, and Dunkirk, that people point to as the definitive one. And it's because of the fact that I think there are times in it that, Nolan lets him experiment and does something and kind of follows his own train of thought. But there are also times where he lets, like, especially with Interstellar and Dunkirk, really changes things profoundly in his sound, in the way he does that sound. And it's funny because I wasn't a huge fan of the Dunkirk score when I saw it in theaters, partially because I do think that sound mix is the best. But when I started listening to it individually, it's like, oh, okay, this is a different. I definitely have greater appreciation for this score now than I did when it was in theater.
Yeah, it's a separate piece of work from Interstellar. Interstellar is a separate piece of work from Inception. Inception is a different piece of work from the Batman. I think he even worked on The Prestige as a producer, to do that. But I like that they're not trying to go for the same thing. And Ridley Scott doesn't really do that. And Verbinski, aside from the Pirates movies, they all have a very distinct sound. He does have directors, I think, like working with Zimmer because it's collaborative. Like, they're working with each other and make each other, like, their images better and the music better. And it definitely makes it a character. I think out of all the movies, probably Dunkirk and Interstellar, the music is as much of a character as the actual characters go. And so that's why I like those scores and impulsiveness, as we talked about with those. But again, I just think Nolan himself is a challenging director. Tenet's obviously very challenging as a movie, but Nolan's a very challenging director. He's trying to push limits. He's trying to do the blockbuster, and I don't know of another director, maybe aside from Villeneuve, trying to do the blockbuster epics, but also making them cerebral and intellectual. The Batman movies, again, are very intellectual, even though some people might look at that. Some of the stuff in there is, it's a comic book movie. It's kind of dumb that you're trying to aim for the intellectual. Again, they're aiming for a higher level than what typical blockbusters go for. I think maybe it's the impactfulness. I know Crimson Tide was very impactful. Tony Scott helped me do that. We talked about trailer, like Malik, the Journey to the Line showing up in trailers. Zimmer's made an impact. Like, when your music starts showing up in other trailers and other people try to copy your your sound that you made from a movie in trailers, that kind of thing. It's very impactful. I just think, as far as all those collaborations go, I think Nolan is the one that really pushed those limits. Those movies tried to make more of a character for the scores.
Yeah, no, definitely. Interstellar. It's God. I love listening to that score. I love the again, all my three favorites have to do with soundscapes, and I mean that's something that's very much been something that I've done a lot as a composer, as an individual composer. As a film composer, I've tried to do more to serve the story in a more traditional sense. But whether in the short films that I've done and the feature that I'm working on, if somebody, but I will say, I'd be curious to see if somebody says, okay, so this is what you're used to. Let me see what you have in mind. And, it's gonna be interesting to see if this leads to anything in the future. But I mean, I'm sure I'll have other scores that I do, but going back to Zimmer, I just, the music in his work is, I mean, even something like I'm struck by how much I appreciate his work from No Time to Die. Like, the James Bond franchise has such a codified sound to it over the years. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I like about, one of the things that is so interesting about the Daniel Craig movies is that, David Arnold had done a few scores for the Bond films before Casino Royale. I think what he did for Casino Royale is just takes it to a different level. And but I mean, part of that is because he's not leaning on the Bond theme, because it's essentially an origin story.
Yeah, you can't do that, right?
Thomas Newman, when he did Skyfall, is coming from a different musical perspective. He's coming from his own perspective, but he still makes it resolutely a Bond film, Bond score. And Hans Zimmer did the exact same thing in No Time to Die, and it was like, oh wow, I forgot that this was possible. But I mean, I think I think that also comes to Daniel Craig wanting to put his stamp on the franchise too.
Yeah. Like that you mentioned, that's interesting. It is it's not a very Zimmery score, other than when I say it's not a very Zimmery score, because he's doing a James Bond movie. You want to make it very James Bondy.
Yeah.
And so so it sounds, the thing I love about the Skyfall score is it harkens back to, John Barry's music. It's a very classical look at, it's trying to bring James Bond back to those roots of the John Barry days. And No Time to Die has a lot of that too, the way it incorporates, obviously, John Barry's scores and things like that. But other than there's a piece toward the end when they're the siege on that island or whatever, where it deliberately or flat out cribs from the Molasses track from Batman Begins, the chase scene. It literally sounds just like that. Other than that, it's not a very Zimmery score, because again, he's trying to service, the Bond franchise and the Bond legacy. And so he has a way of doing that too. You don't want to come to it's 25, 26 movies by the time No Time to Die roll. You don't want to come in and take the legacy away. You want to serve that. So again, it's interesting because you've got Maverick and you've got No Time to Die that were delayed because of COVID. Maybe we're planning on being released around the same time, but they kind of do the same thing. Maybe opposite things, as far as No Time to Die trying to serve the franchise legacy, and then Maverick being a better propulsive score than the 86 version was. Yeah. It's just interesting seeing the different kind of approaches to both of the scores, especially since they were both delayed by a couple of years.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think, with Maverick, I think it's the combination of, what we're familiar with Faltermeyer's score, as well as Zimmer's aesthetic, and then the way they use the Lady Gaga song, the way they use the music for Hold My Hand, I think is just so wonderful in that movie. And basically making that love theme was such a strong choice. And we haven't really talked about have you seen Dune?
No. I've got like 30 movies. Like I just tweeted something about, I finally got a hold of a bunch of movies. Got a hold of the Batman. I got a hold of Drive My Car. I got a hold of Everything Everywhere All at Once. So I finally got a hold of all these movies that I wasn't able to see, but I've got so many movies, and Dune is another one of those that I've been meaning to check out. And I haven't heard a single note of the Dune score because I want to experience that with the movie. So it's something that I'll definitely get around to, but I've got so many movies that I'm trying to catch up on. Dune is on there.
I will admit, I don't even know that would necessarily make my top 5 as far as his scores. I respect how much he loves the source material, and I love how much because I mean, there are like 3 albums worth of stuff. There's sketches that he did, there's alternate tracks that he did, and then there's the soundtrack. I mean, all of that stuff is interesting to listen to. Maybe I need to see the movie again, but it's like, for some reason, the movie it felt like a Hans Zimmer score when I was watching the movie. So it's like, okay, I'm glad he finally won his second Oscar. Should have happened decades ago. But, I'm glad he finally won. But I'm glad that it's something as personal for him as Dune is, because I know that was a big deal for him to do. So before we wrap up, though, because I mean we've covered a lot of ground, and there's so much more that we could talk about. If you could give us a few other soundtracks, whether we've talked about them or not, or brought them up or not, that are some of your favorites from Zimmer's.
Okay, well, the one thing that I know we mentioned The Holiday. Again, he's done action movies, he's done horror movies, he's done dramas, he's done comedies. The comedies with Green Card is one that I want to mention. There are 2 tracks on there, and again, I mentioned it kind of like Driving Miss Daisy, where it's more repetitive. He has one theme that he plays over and over again with some variations on it. Mm-hmm. But on the soundtrack, it's Restless Elephants and Cafe Africa, and they work as a single track. Again, being Zimmer, he splits them up into 2 different ones. Yeah. But the way that it kind of supports the Peter Weir imagery in there, the way that it's I don't know, you have to listen to it. It's a very fun, very beautiful score. There's a part toward the end of Cafe Africa that's ethereal. It's like next level to me, right? I hear it and it takes me I zone out and it takes me to a different place. It's toward the end. I think it's the last minute of Cafe Africa. It's just so gorgeously done. Like we talked about The Holiday for Nancy Myers. It's very, again, it has the metronomic rhythm in some parts, but it's a very orchestra-driven score. It's very gorgeous and it's very, I don't want to say intrusive, but you do notice the music. So I want to mention those. I know that I like his score that he worked with for John Powell for Kung Fu Panda, talking about Asian landscapes. And then, there are so many, I could mention all of them. Like, you talk about Tears of the Sun, like having that African influence. You could talk about, again, I love Matchstick Men. I didn't mention that. It's the Ridley Scott collaboration. Yeah, that's a fantastic. Idiosyncratic. Yeah, it's idiosyncratic. It doesn't fit in with anything else that he's done. I think they're all the same, but I think for At World's End, the third part of the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, especially since I think Dead Man's Chest might be one of his weakest scores, just because it does just copy everything that the first one did. Yeah. But the new themes that he introduced for Pirates of the Caribbean At World's End are just so wonderfully done. And the new love theme he has for Will and Elizabeth is so great. It takes it to a next level instead of just repeating. It has a whole new sonic bounce. And then the other one I do want to mention, I'm not a big fan of the movie itself, but I do love the Man of Steel score. If you're talking about soundscapes, he creates a soundscape for Krypton. He creates the soundscape for Zod and his minions. It just feels so epic. And in a way, it's a detriment to the movie because it's so epic and over the top that it kind of takes away a lot of the humanness that I think you need for a Superman movie. Yeah. It's so bombastic. And again, you're not going to equal the John Williams. I'm sorry to all the people that didn't grow up on the John Williams Superman score, but it literally says Superman. Yeah. in the music. It's so iconic and you know what it is. You're not going to match that. I don't think Zimmer's theme matches it as far as being a hero, but if you're talking soundscapes, I love the way that the score envelops you. It's just such a gorgeous, beautiful. I say this score, and I do love it. And again, another movie that works separate. I do think that if it wasn't for his score, Dark Phoenix would have been absolutely a travesty. I think that score works. It's noticeable again because what's happening on screen isn't very memorable.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a way like the I can't off the top of my head, I can't do it, but he has a theme that starts off very ominous. And then at the end, when the X-Men are working together, which is the best part of every X-Men, they finally work as a team, he's able to take that ominous theme and he ups it an octave and it makes it heroic just by changing the octave. So it I don't know. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah.
But, you know, like we talked about, I could mention every Zimmer score. There's things about it. Maybe aside again, Dead Man's Chest and Madagascar are the first one, probably my least favorite Zimmer scores, just because the way they're just lazy. I think they're not. There's nothing I can really pull from them. But yeah, Zimmer's. I got so excited like you about his scores that I would go bend over backwards to try to find bootleg copies and kind of download them from the internet, try to find things so I could, put together my own suites and things like that, or see how they worked. It got to that point where I was just so obsessed. I backed off a little bit, but as far as composers go, I was just obsessed with everything he did and trying to tie everything together. The way he has moments in every score that just envelop me and take me to another place. I love his scores. I love his scores. There's nothing else.
No, absolutely. We've already talked about a lot of my other favorites. I mean, Millennium is one that I absolutely love. Days of Thunder is one I really enjoy. I mean, it's a silly score, but it's a good one.
It's memorable. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. We basically covered everything else. I love The Dark Knight. I forgot Matchstick Men is an absolutely tremendous score of his. That might be one of my favorites of his for Ridley Scott. That's just such a great one. And
it's an anti-Zimmer score. It doesn't sound anything like what you'd expect.
And then of course the Sherlock Holmes movies, which he did. And as down as I am on, is kind of, not impressed as I was with doing it at first. I mean, I feel like that's a score that I'm probably going to come to appreciate more and more over the years.
Right.
And just because of the fact that, especially once part 2 comes and we get to hear that entire story play out with Zimmer's themes. But Darren, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah. Oh man, seriously, you're being able to join you for that Orson Welles conversation, the conversation we've had, having you on for Rad. Like you're one of my favorite people. And I don't know, we're just able to chat about things and enlighten each other. At least I hope I'm able to enlighten you the way you enlighten me. But obviously, in listening to your music and what you've composed, and I'm so excited for your new project that you have coming out that you're able to score. And I'm so excited for you. I'm so excited to listen to that score. I can't wait to hear all that. But it's being able to talk about stuff that I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
Especially Zimmer and the way that his music has informed my music score taste. It's just, again, I appreciate you for having me on. I know we've chatted about this for a while, and I've been itching to come back on Sonic Cinema. And so I'm glad that we're able to do it for this. And I look forward to being able to have more conversations with you.
Oh yeah, I absolutely look forward to it as well. I mean, you're one of my absolute favorites on Twitter, and I love that conversation we had with on Rad. I love the conversation we had on Wells, and I was looking forward to this for a while because of the fact that we have this shared love of Hans Zimmer. That I think to a certain extent, I think he's almost underrated because of the fact that he doesn't have the degree of acclaim that I think a lot of composers do, or certainly like a John Williams or Jerry Goldsmith. And I think it's because of how much of his work does kind of happen in movies that are not as good as movies that they would work on. But yeah, it's been absolutely great to talk to you about Hans Zimmer and share that love.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Brian. You're one of the greats. So thank you.
I'd like to thank Darren for joining me to discuss Hans Zimmer. This is a conversation that we've been interested in having for a while. That's going to do it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. The rest of the summer's going to have a lot of really fun guests, some first timers, some returning, and some fun discussions. Check out, hopefully, in the coming weeks or so, my soundtrack album to the score for Brian Ackley's Player PhD will be out. You'll be able to listen to that. And, that'll be it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Rate and review, subscribe at YouTube, Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. Check us out at patreon.com/SonicCinema and, of course, www.sonic-cinema.com. As I teased in the episode, I'm going to end this one without my usual fanfare with a piece that I wrote in 1999 that is inspired by Hans Zimmer's music. It is called Ethereal Atmospheres, and I hope you enjoy.